I want to thank Chad Remley, Sky Wills, for being here to support our webinar and introduce today's topic. And Chad, I'll read a little bit of his bio, is currently the Regional Director, Soil Survey Region 5. Previous experience includes mapping soils in Missouri as a soil scientist, MORA project leader, liaison to U.S. Corps of Engineers on wetlands, assistant state soil scientist, soil data quality specialist, and state soil scientist of Kansas. Chad is a graduate of Purdue University with a Bachelor of Science and University of Missouri with a Master of Science. Sky is currently the National Leader for Soil Research, previously a resources and research soil scientist working on dynamic soil properties and sampling statistics. Degrees are from Kansas State University and Iowa State University. With that, Sky, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you.
All right, thanks, Sean. I assume everybody can see me. Sean will speak up if he can't. So what we're going to talk about today is something you should all be familiar with, DSP, data collection and project planning. Things have been standardized and finalized a little bit more than you may have seen in the past, so we want to give you those final guidelines and really, well, just set out some expectations and further work. Okay, I'm not sure. Might be having a technical difficulty, so bear with me. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you've all heard of dynamic soil properties by now. Dynamic soil properties are properties that change with land use and management, and this thing could include things that we document in soil survey and things that people document for other reasons. In the past, these have been called use-dependent properties by people like Grossman, Deb Harms, and Kathy Seibold worked in this in the past. And then Arlene Toole and others, including myself, worked on the Soil Change Guide and really used the term dynamic soil properties in order to sort of formalize our concept. So why might we want to know something about dynamic soil properties? Well, dynamic soil properties are needed to address some emerging issues. So instead of just the typical inherent genetic mapped properties, we want to be able to address issues that are important to NRCS, other land managers, other policy and decision makers, and just things that people ask us for on a regular basis. This includes assessing soil condition, improving conservation, either recommendations or knowing what happens when we apply conservation. And then we want to be able to predict and scale soil change. So other researchers might measure small research plots, but we're soil survey. We can apply those results across the whole landscape and really say some powerful things. So an example of this approach is if you have somebody that goes out and, let's say, measures aggregate stability. If you get a result back from either a commercial university lab or our lab that says you have 25% aggregate stability, what does that mean for you? Well, that might mean something really good in one situation if you're in, say, an Amarillo soil, which is pretty sandy, but there's a lot of soils that 25% is not that good for, including the Kirkland soil in Oklahoma, which has a little bit more clay, it's a little more humid environment. So we want to have a context for what that means. If I tell you something is a pH of 7, you have a reasonable idea of what that means in terms of production, land use, capability. We want to try to provide that same context for these dynamic soil properties. So the next things we're going to work on for DSPs are collaborating with some of our other institutional cooperators, including the Soil Health Division, including NRCS state offices, including our university cooperators and NGOs. So that might include these joint projects with the Soil Health Division. It might include our internal state-involved projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we want to do that in a minute. But I want to tell you about one particular project we've been working on called the Science of Soil Health Initiative. So these are cooperator agreements across a range of soil and management systems for the whole country, basically. And they're based on the Soil Health Tech Note. I don't know if you've seen this, but I'll share this PowerPoint when we're done, so you can look it up if you're interested. These are a set of lab properties that the Soil Health Division recommends for both local and national assessment of soil health. And so we want to measure these same methods across the country and see what we can find out about them. We also want to measure some soil health field assessments and do DSP properties and soil survey characterization pits in the same areas, so we can try to link our impressive talents and resources of soil survey and combine those with some new and specific things that conservation and soil health people have been using. So what we're hoping we come up with at the end of this is a list of relevant dynamic soil properties and reference values. So maybe there are some properties that are really good in some areas and not others. We also want to know what we can use those for interpretations for. Can we measure one benchmark soil in an area and then apply those results to other similar soils? And then finally, we want to be able to say something about conservation plans and management systems in areas where these have been evaluated. How can we use the information we gain to do some work for our partners in state offices and soil health divisions? So there's a need to aggregate this DSP information across these projects, right? And we're working on how to do that. And then we also need to think about how we're going to make maps, how we might convey this information to other people, how we're going to provide this to decision makers. And so there's a lot of work left to be done. For inherent properties, we talk about, you know, we aggregate and correlate and put the information into Surgo, and then it goes out on Web Soil Survey and other platforms. We need to think about similar ways we're going to do that for dynamic soil properties. And so one way we can do that is to combine it with our ecological site efforts. So we know that ecological site concepts can be used to stratify the landscape into meaningful units, and we know that we can use them to help make management decisions, and really just to serve as a framework for, usually we use it for biological and vegetation issues, but we can do the same with dynamic soil properties and soil properties in general. So if you think about an ecological site state and transition models, often they include, a converted state or a field state or something about how the land can be managed. And so we think, we think that before, in addition to this vegetation information, and a really general little box that includes a whole lot of the world in some places is included in that little converted state box for this example. So we think that we can really expand on that information and say something that our decision makers and our land managers, we can use this kind of framework to provide them with information. So I'm going to take this out of the state and transition model system for a minute to think about it. Maybe this is a possible way that we could give this information to people. So maybe we have the known functions that we might get for a native plant community, but we can also find out what kind of functions we might have for different kinds of production systems within agriculture and range. And then we can start to say things about, well, what's the potential of this system in an ecological context, like what is the best thing you can do with the site? And then maybe there's something that's attainable for certain production groups or for certain kinds of management. And we can start to say something about what we think those levels are. And if you think about anything could be on this soil function ecosystem service line. It could be carbon, it could be aggregate stability, it could be really any number of things that we're interested in. Oops, sorry about that. And then within any one of those systems, we can actually get really specific in terms of management, like tillage and rotations, and we can start to help our conservation partners organize what happens to soil properties with any of these specific uses. So back to that Science of Soil Health Initiative example. So this is preliminary results for phospholipid fatty acid. I'm not sure that total PLFA is a great measure of something, but we can generally think of it as biological activity. So in a perennial system, you might have a certain level of biological activity that represents an ecological potential. And within the managed system, you might have a different level of potential. And then within that, within different management systems, you might have an even finer level of what could be expected. And so we think that if we organize things like this, this can help us show other people what we've been measuring. It can help us communicate to land users and policymakers about maybe what's possible given these different systems, or maybe what's likely given an applied conservation practice. Another thing that we are working on right now is assessing these typical or likely values for soil health metrics. And these curves are based on different, what we're calling peer groups. So a soil, taxa, rainfall, texture, all of that, all of these things can be mixed together, and we can come up with what is most likely. So for this one, a given soil carbon level, you can say, well, it's the 75th percentile. I don't know if you guys remember your standardized test scores from when you were in elementary school, and it said you were in the, well, you know, however high a percentage you were in the class. So this is just comparing these soils to what their peers might be. And you guys might remember the SMAP curves. These are a new updated version of those. None of these are final. This is just an example, but this is what we can do. The more data we collect and the more consistent it is across the country, the more information we can give people. So that's kind of why we're going forward with this national instruction and bulletin to help us really get some standardized metrics that we can compare. And then I've talked about that Science of Soil Health initiative and all of our cooperators, but we've been collecting a lot of this DSP data over time within Soil Survey and at the National Soil Survey Center. And then we've got a couple of little projects going on about how maybe we could present this information, maybe we can map it, maybe we can have little interactive tools, maybe we can just have massive data sets to share with people. And so that's some of the ways we're trying to interact with it. But we want it to become more institutionalized and more specific. So this national instruction and national bulletin are a standardized way for all of us to collect data so that we can go through the same sort of guidelines and the same sort of routine that we do in our everyday work. So there are two different ways that DSP data collection is organized, and it becomes a little bit tricky when we try to think about this. And Chad and I have gone around and around on this, like how the simple way to explain this, and I think what we're going to do is just lay it out there, and we're just going to give you all the details, and it may be a little bit confusing at first, but then we'll double back and talk about individual projects, and I think you'll get what we're after. Because there's two ways or reasons that we can collect samples, and I'm calling this the kind. Like, do you want it to be dispersed, or do you want a project? And this is really better outlined in Chapter 9 of the new Soil Survey Manual, but dispersed is that we want all the information we can get everywhere. We're just out doing our daily soil survey activities, we're collecting information, and let's get a little bit more information so that we can use it for these DSP activities. So it's not really targeted for DSPs, it's just to get more information. And it is possible that you want to spread things out among work conditions, or it's just dispersed. It's not really targeted. Projects are really a specific target, a kind of data collection, in this case a DSP project, where you're really trying to go out and assess something on the landscape, usually for a target soil or target system or target land use, and it's much more guided and specific. Now within both of those interact with the intensity of data collection, because data collection can be useful at these different kinds of intensity levels. And this can go everywhere from extensive, which means it's got a big extent, we're going to collect lots of data everywhere, but it's only kind of superficial, not a ton of detail. And this will be the case for like initial soil surveys. It's going to be extensive. We're not going to try to do intensive information collection everywhere. On the other hand, if you are in a location where you really want to know DSP information about a certain soil, certain condition, or maybe you're just collecting lab samples somewhere very specific to a location, then that's the intensive. Intensive just means we're collecting samples, we're getting a lot of data for every single sample that's collected. So the national instruction defined tiers of DSP data collection for all of soil survey. And the idea is that for initial soil survey, it'll just be focused on that extensive soil data collection. We know that there are other priorities, there are other things that need to be done, so this shouldn't hamper those efforts. This is just very simply doing what we should be doing anyway. For update soil survey, there are two levels of data collection, that intermediate data collection and the extensive data collection, and the National Instruction and National Bulletin set forth the goal of having one project per year. So we want everybody to start thinking about collecting DSP data and start planning for how to do that. And then we'll go through a detail in a minute. There's an extensive data collection element here for KSSL samples. So anytime you're doing lab analysis, we want to put forward just a little bit more effort so that we can get really intensive, really good DSP data out of that effort. And it should be without a ton more work and a lot more information. That's the idea anyway. So disperse additional information while completing other soil survey activities, and projects are really targeted at a particular kind of soil or a particular kind of condition, and we are going to ask for some replication to really hone in on what that thing you're after is. So these are the two different kinds. I'm going to start on the intensive tier. This is the data that we want to collect really anytime there's KSSL submission, but also with any really specific, really intensive data collection. So the idea is there's a certain way to collect these samples, which includes taking slightly shallower samples, more replication, measuring all of these samples. But once you get it to KSSL, then we're going to measure some extra things. These properties don't require a lot of extra work on the collection end. They require a little bit of work on Kellogg Soil Survey in order to execute all of these. And the interaction of the two should make this really useful. There's also some other optional elements that we don't currently measure, but we are trying to figure out how to capture those. We want to be able to join our efforts with those of other institutions, other labs, so that we can make the best use of our data and be as useful to others as possible. So for the intermediate tier, these are samples where you may not be collecting samples to send to KSSL, but these include things you can measure in the field or things that you might measure in a field office lab. So we realize not everyone has a field office lab, so these can be determined in concert with your KSSL liaison or with someone from the DSP focus team or someone such as myself, where we know that these aren't always going to be possible, but we want to get these as often and as frequently as possible. And so these could be a part of those DSP intermediate projects, and they should also be done where possible with KSSL sampling. That helps us get an idea of what the really detailed lab data means in terms of these less intensive, a little more broad-scale field conditions. And these will include things like vegetation measurements, ecological site ID, any soil health field assessments that your state and local entities are doing, and things that might be of interest locally like earthworms, infiltration KSAT, things like that we want to know more about, but they don't require a lot of sample collection. And then finally, that extensive tier is really, we all should be doing this everywhere. It's not going to require a lot of extra work. We just want to make sure that these things get populated fully in the database, because when someone else or we need to look in the database for information about how earth cover kind is impacting different properties, like, epipedon thickness or something, then we need this information to be able to draw from. So we really want to get the basics of, you have to have this stuff in the database. So that's what we're after with the extensive tier. So for all KSSL characterization projects, I think Chad might go through this a little bit, but we are going to follow these DSP sampling guidelines. We want to start to get a good, robust data set so that we can say stuff. Instead of having to say, oh, we don't collect that information or we don't have enough detail to know, we're going to do a little bit of extra work up front, and we're going to collect data in a way that we can say something about dynamic soil properties really for every piece of information we gather. It shouldn't be a lot of extra work, just a little bit of guidelines and really thinking through what we can gain from these projects. So we're going to follow the latest guidelines. We're going to do intermediate and extensive data collection at the same time. We're going to do it's really just best practices in terms of collecting and maintaining sample integrity. We do have a couple of extra worksheets that we're going to actually ask you to fill out for data tracking purposes. It shouldn't be onerous. I don't think anything is that hard. I mean, we may have to talk to a few more people than we're used to. We may have to go a little bit out of our way to find cooperation to get everything that we want, but I don't think any of it is above and beyond what we can accomplish. So the National Bulletin basically outlines how to use the National Instruction. So those data tiers in the National Instruction, the National Bulletin basically says, we want everybody who isn't doing an initial soil survey to do one DSP project a year. It provides all the guidance documents, and it lays out what we're expecting. There will be challenges with these guidances because they're new. Well, they're not really new. They've been used for a while, but anytime you take something tested in a few places and expand it to the whole country, you're bound to run into some problems. But think of it as you would all other soil guidance. There are places where things don't work. There are adaptations that have to be made. If you are using these documents and you find they're not useful for you, let us know. Let your liaison know. Let me know. Let anybody you know on the DSP focus team. We want this to be an interactive process where we're not going to cut you slack and let you not do things, but we do realize you may have difficulties. Maybe we left out a choice in a choice list. Maybe something isn't possible in a really rocky soil and we need to make sure it's clear that you don't have to do it there, things like that. So we want to have some interaction with this guidance. And Chad is going to go through the work plan worksheet, which is one of these guidance documents, which is really at the heart of planning and executing a DSP project. So just to kind of line these all up, so I think I've said everything that's on this slide already. We have dispersed and project versions of DSP data collection, and then we have these levels of different properties we collect: extensive, intermediate, and intensive. So, you know, they interact a little bit. It maybe is a little bit confusing to think about this in two different dimensions, but the idea is if you go through the work plan worksheet, you go through the documents, you can actually plan out what you need to collect to get done what you need to do, and then we've put some guidance in place that we can get the information we need nationally. One thing I didn't cover within any of this and isn't necessarily obvious is interim data storage. We do not have all of the fields necessary in NRCS at this time. The things that are laboratory data, that's not difficult. We can store that stuff. It's really the management and the metadata of these samples that's a little difficult to keep track of, specifically for the DSP project. So we have a Cloud Vault location. We'll store stuff. Basically, this will be part of the interaction when you're planning these projects. Interact with your Soil Survey Center liaison, interact with me. We have the documents up, look through them, ask questions, and we'll make sure that we get all of the information retained. The other thing is anytime you're submitting samples to the Kellogg Soil Survey Lab, all of these background information should be submitted with those samples, so that they'll go into the sample submission folder and there'll be background information that we can look at if there are any issues as we go through the data analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Chad so that he can talk about the DSP work plan worksheet to guide you through the planning process. And he's pre-populated it with an example project that hopefully will get you thinking. But keep in mind, not everything is going to line up perfectly, right? You're going to have some variations on a theme, or maybe pretty wide variations. So, whoops, I did want to I did want to put a plug in here before you start, though, Chad, that the DSP focus team is actively working on this stuff, and we are looking for participation and leadership. If you are interested in this at all, if you have some leadership knack, some organization knack, maybe some data visualization, if you want to work on any of those areas, we are looking for people to get involved. So I'll turn over to you, Chad.
Okay, thank you. Waiting for Sean to give me control. Okay. Hope everybody. You can see the DSP work plan worksheet.
Oh,
So,
yep, it's up.
all right, thank you. So as Sky covered, everything, we're going to take a little time here and go through this work plan worksheet as it relates to projects. I'm going to try and do this as an open session with leaving enough time for questions at the end. Sky and Sean will be monitoring the questions and feeding them in as we go through this. I work in the Great Plains, so it's a Great Plains example. I know that doesn't apply, but like Sky highlighted earlier, we're trying to take a worksheet, apply it to both KSL sampling, designated DSP projects, and apply it to the whole country. So trying to make one form work. We did it as a bulletin so that there is time for corrections, and we can continually upgrade this and work through it. Okay, so obviously we need working down through here, we need a project title. We like to have on the project sponsor an objective. We like to work with the states or with any other, the resourceful scientists, statesful scientists. We can always do a project ourselves. Depends on whether you're working on a KSL, soil characterization sampling project, or whether you're doing a designated DSP project. Listing your sponsors. It's very important. What is the objective? It could be as simple as I'm doing a soil characterization sample for the Keith series, or I'm working on a designated DSP project where I'm looking at certain indicators, looking at the extent or effects of a management system on the particular soil. Deliverables, what do you hope to get out of this? Could be as simple saying is that this is required by a national bulletin, or it's, we need soil health indicators to help our local customers. Other deliverables, please take photos. Please, I know we have an issue with how we store photos, but photos help tell the story. I'm hoping everybody will do that. We need to communicate the story not only for us and how we're doing the study, but use it in public affairs. Project scope, we want to talk about the extent of the project. Make sure that you look at Chapter 9 in the Soil Survey Manual. It's very helpful. It's been out there and it's been there for a while. This is not something that's totally new, but for some of you, it will be. So, and like we said, we pre-populated this from a project we did in Kansas a few years ago. Some of this is analysis practice name, who prepared it, is it a benchmark study soil? I highly recommend that you try and start with benchmarks. It would be great if everybody would sample some of our reference ESD sites. We need to know what we can get to and what seems to be existing under the current conditions out there with minimal disturbance. And then project design, I just want to spend a minute on that, talking about capturing the way you're going to sample, conceptualizing how your plots and your pet-ons. We talked a lot about when you are out doing soil characterization sampling, you should be thinking about how you're representing that sample, whether this is for a TUD or it's going to represent the OSD, and you're going to send it into KSL. How are you're taking the sample as a representative of the landform? How are you going to do your satellites to show the variability? We do require 2 satellites down to 50 centimeters. How are you going to take those to show the variability of the site? You know, as we record all this data in the future is going to be very important. Had we started doing this 20 years ago, we'd be in a lot better shape, but we're starting now. We'll get it. Minimum plot size, 10 by 10. I'll highlight that as we move towards production of raster maps. Standard raster production is a 10 by 10 meter pixel. Might as well have a 10 by 10 meter plot. Also describe the management systems, get the best information you can. Understand the worksheet, again, is designed to address multiple things. So it will be a simplified, when you're doing it for KSSL, you won't have everything that you're going to see here in a minute as we go down through here. But when you're doing a designated project, DSSL or DSSP project, I'm on the DSS team, so yeah, that helps. Okay, describe the ecological site, soil landscape to be captured. I'm a block diagram guy. You can ask some of my staff. I love block diagrams. State and transition models. Please try and convey as much concept as you can. Soils to be sampled as part of the project. Obviously, you know, you list your soil, your classification, what are the components, what are your inclusions, similar soils, what may be, you know, beginning to adjacent to it that could have impact on your sampling. General information about targeted soils. We talk about the landforms, texture, aspect, any rock fragments, etc. Describing the conditions selected. Refer to the ecological state, the management systems on the site or on your plot sites, because you can have multiple sites, where these are located. And anything that might impact the sampling of those sites, make a note so that you also remember why your samples may be a little different than expected. If you have the ability to do a reference condition, that would be great. Describe any alternate conditions and why you think those impact sampling design. For this study, we didn't really have any because it's just a gently rolling, gently rolling soil with had very defined systems. I include the state and transition models. By the end of 2020, I think most everybody will have at least access to a provisional ecological site description. You should be able to provide that. Scrolling down, what are the targeted conditions? So in this study, we were looking at a corn soybean versus a no-till system and a conventional tillage system. And we want to describe what we're doing, what's the vegetation to there. This also applies if we're in a forested setting. Don't have much of that in the Great Plains, but it's out there. We talked about our chisel plow, ridge till, versus 10 no-till that's greater than 10 years old. Where's the location of the project area? We all have GPS units. Please use them. Let's get that recorded. And you have a general direction of the state, the county, FIPS code, and go forth. Some places that's going to be a soil survey code. And let's see, selected speed soil map units in the project area that could contain phases. This is when you're going to be using sampling locations. This particular case I didn't have that because I was just in my series. And then trying to estimate what our sources of spatial variability is. In the Keith study, we were across a single county. We were about 12 to 15 miles apart on our study for each of the different, to get each of the different management systems. So we were looking at elevation changes, temperature, precip, aspect, anything that might alter what we would expect for the results. Since you're trying to compare systems, you want to know what changes you might occur naturally because of the changes in aspect or precip. Landscape sources of variability. What are we talking about? Where are we at on the landform? What's our slope percent, slope shape, convex, aspect, and what are the conclusions of what might be the largest single source of variability within our map unit polygon. So we tried, in this particular study, we tried to avoid slopes greater than 3%. Okay. For our site, We described the site. We were row and furrow. We've tried to lift some. Again, I'm sure we'll have edits here as we work on this this worksheet, but we've tried to capture a lot. Conclusions, how we'll sample, any special instructions. We obviously say we'd be midway between the rows. Rows and furrows would be our biggest issue. If we had to relocate, what would we do? Avoid rock outcrops, things like that. Keep out of wheel tracks, anything like that. Plan replication and DSP identification. If you're doing a KSL sampling, you're not going to have a plan replication. You're going to have your single pit site. We're collecting your samples, your 2 satellites. You'll be recording simplified data and sending that in with your NASA's pet-on description in the KSL sampling sheet. As we get here in this one, where we're going into more of a designated DSP project, we had 4 different systems we were looking at: a restored prairie, soil health system, a no-till, and a conventional till. We obviously we're going to replicate the sites, and I want to point out that also we have another document. There's several, I think 7 attachments total that you can look at that are there for supporting everything from the NASA's columns, but I would direct you towards the DSP sampling ID guide, and will help you guide you through labeling. And within each site, you know, we had the plot and replication. We've got a site number, a site ID, whatever the condition was that we're trying to manage the condition we're looking at, the plot IDs, how we're going to label the pet-ons. So you can see it can be complicated. That's why we're using a worksheet, so you make sure that your samples get collected and we get them properly identified when they're coming in. And also, one of the things that we're going to require is you'll have to ask the KSSL for cardboard boxes until we get a source figured out to get that to you. For the undisturbed sample, they'll have to be put into a small cardboard box. And you just want to barely break those just enough to get them into the box so we can have kind of the undisturbed condition the best we can. So the box will be coming in, and with that, we have everything on the new Cloud Vault. You can find all the attachments, and we can talk about whatever questions you have, and we can go back through this document wherever somebody wants to look at. And there's crickets. Sean and Sky, are we getting any questions?
Well, we are, but they're mostly questions that we can answer pretty quickly.
Okay.
Sky's been putting a lot of those in the Q&A for everybody to see, the replies, and there's been some of the chat. One of them, maybe, Chad, you could speak to while people think of some questions to put in is, how many satellite samples are standard? I think you mentioned 2, something 4.
Yeah, if you're doing the KSL sampling, it's 2, and it's only 50 centimeters. So you're out there doing your KSL sample, got your pit dug, and you kind of need to look at the landform and say, okay, what is my source of variability out here, and move equal distance in that axis direction for sampling your satellites. If you're trying to give us a representation of the site, we're not there. I'm a new young person that comes on 10 years from now, and I'm trying to understand this data. It's kind of like when we looking at data from the 1950s, trying to figure out, rebuild that picture in my mind, because half the time when we go to the field, we struggle to find what we originally thought was there. It's the same concept here. We're trying to understand the natural variability that we see on the site under potentially a given management system. So the satellites are there to assist in that, along with the regular standard sampling. If you do the designated products, yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, no, go ahead and finish your thought. I was just going to bring up a couple other questions.
Oh, okay. No, you're doing designated, when you lay out your plot analysis, you're going to be, taking your samples to figure out variability, which is on your plots as you're moving from the different systems. I think that'll be pretty consistent when you lay that out. I don't think you'll have an issue with that. So, okay, what's the next question?
So there's a few questions. One that I think I kind of answered, but I'll say it out loud. The 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 centimeter options on sampling, those aren't meant to mix horizons. Those are subsamples within horizons, and if you have horizon breaks near those breaks, discuss that with your liaison and have a sampling plan ahead of time. There's also a question about assessing the same site over time, which we have done. We've just used the same guidance documents, but modified it a little bit so that you come back over time. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. I know the Nebraska offices have been doing a fair bit of that.
Yeah, for this key study, we were planning on 5-year increments. The landowners expect us to reappear. So
yeah, and so that can certainly be entered in the work plan. I mean, it doesn't have to be just spatial. It can include temporal stuff also. Then the other one that we might want to touch on is someone asked what we think. Oh, I think the question might have moved, but so how many hours of our typical work year would you estimate the DSP project will take?
Ooh, I like that one. Because the answer is going to be extremely variable depending on what is you're going to look at. We didn't define the project. Anywhere from a week to 2 weeks would be my guess, but it just depends on how many different systems you're trying to compare, the complexity of the landforms that you're trying to compare, access. There's always things that get in the way, but usually it's a week of planning and a week of sampling. It's something generally that we don't think of a single person doing. We, at least in our region, we try and get some folks to assist when the actual sampling happens. So, I would say around 2 weeks or so for a project. Plus maybe, a few more days for planning.
So someone asked how many Catena projects have been done. That seems like a promising way. We've only just done like 2 or 3 Catena projects, and mostly, as we started testing these pilots, we realized that the Catena approach can be really efficient because you can get multiple soils, even multiple benchmark soils that have slightly different functions at the same time. So I think it's a really good approach. It's not going to work for everyone. It kind of depends on the landscape, but it was pretty successful where we've done it thus far, but we don't have a ton of experience with it yet.
Region 12 has a question about this worksheet. It says, so this worksheet covers everything from project overview to site-specific and even individual sample data?
Yes.
Well, it covers the plan for that data. You don't actually enter the data in it.
Yes. Okay. I didn't quite catch that. So, yeah, it's just how you get your data or how you're going to lay things out. There's also other attachments with the National Bulletin and instruction that will assist you in understanding that.
Yeah, and so we have a question that anytime we can use NRCS reports to populate or generate the forms needed when submitting samples, it reduces time and data entry errors, and asks about any plans to create some edit or NRCS reports based on site and pet on tables. So there was a previously existing DSP workbook that it was actually you enter data in Excel and put it into NRCS in multiple ways. That, we are really low on staffing and we are trying to get that regenerated, but it is not done yet.
Milton's asking a question. Where have these Catena projects been done? Can you talk about what parts of the country?
So I know there's been one done in Minnesota because I worked on it. I think we've also done a project, I want to say Missouri did something on kind of a Catena basis. I would have to look to see where the others have been done, but I know we did one in Minnesota in a closed drainage basin system where you have kind of a summit, side slope, depression Catena. And that's the one covered in Chapter 9.
Darren is asking about landowner access, and are you generally finding them willing to give access and answer management questions?
For our region, when we're doing the DSP studies, the answer is yes. They seem to be very interested, especially the ones doing the soil health system. They like comparison. They want to know how they're doing, or they want baseline data. They just want to know where they're at.
Yeah, and you've agreed to share your data with them and made that part of your pitch, right, Chad?
That's correct. We share all the data we collect with them. We don't share the neighbors, but we share their data with them. So, and if sometimes they all don't care and they don't share because they're all neighbors. Other times that can be a sensitive issue. But we do share that landowners' data, everything we collect with them. They get the KSSL data output. You know, we make a quick little 4 or 5 pages for them. Here's everything that we collected and took a reading on. And they seem to really like that.
So there's a question you might want to speak to, Chad, that managing the projects in NRCS assigned as a DSP project type. What is the progress reporting unit, number of projects, acres, other, question mark?
Well, that's where the regional director would say, we can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It depends on the scope of the project.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will depend on the scope. Generally, we put the DSP project in there and we leave that blank, and we can work that out.
Darren has a follow-up question. It's not sharing the neighbor's data, but publishing it on SoilWeb seems a tricky balancing act.
Well, none of this has been published yet.
Yeah, nothing's really been published. If we were to publish it, we would not use the locations. We'd just talk about the trends. You know,
and aggregated data.
As an aggregated data.
Right. Do sampling. Oh, this is someone asking, we want to do sampling in areas that are not currently under anthropogenic management, like marsh migration. I actually think these projects are being planned as DSP, so I obviously yada-yada over that, but it looks like in a marsh system. I think that's a fantastic idea. Those totally count. The idea is to be, I mean, the focus, and this is partially Chad's bias because of where he is in the world, the focus has kind of been on these agronomic systems in the middle where this is really important for management and conservation, and our, NRCS is really interested in this stuff. But we've done these projects in forested systems under different management regimes. I think it lends itself pretty perfectly to changing environment and coastal systems. So yeah, I think marshes is a great idea.
Jeff has a question that, we can manage these projects in NRCS, but what is the progress reporting unit? Number of projects or acres or something else?
It's the number of projects. The regional director is the one responsible for acres. Otherwise, it's the number of projects.
Any other questions from the audience out there?
So this I'll read this last one, Sean, that came in. An alternate way to Catena's, inspired by this marsh question, would be to sample all the land uses for a given soil. We'd like to go back and get 3 other land uses for our Georgia project, and that would cover all the ways the soil is used besides developed. And yes, that is an alternate way to approach this. And I think in Chapter 9 that would be, I don't remember how we described that kind of project, but that's certainly, that's a project. That's a good way to think about it. You're going out and you're going to try to cover a soil in all the ways that it's used.
Right, that would be the DSP range, so is the way you described it. Where you're looking at all the range of for the different management systems on a single soil.
Right.
And
so someone asked, oh, sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You were saying the same thing.
Oh, yeah, so someone's asking about a copy of all the chat questions and provide answers to them in a PDF. One of the guidance documents is a frequently asked question. I think if we could copy these and get them added to the frequently asked questions, that might be a good idea. So we will do that in some project or fashion. And Mike Lindsay asked, oh, go ahead. There's a minimum number of projects per state per year anticipated.
Well, if you're
I don't know about per state.
Our leadership for SPSD is dictated. If you're an update MLRA office, you will do 1 DSP project per year currently. If you're initial office, the only thing you're doing with initials, you're doing the extensive. You still, when you submit your samples for KSSL, you'll have to follow the submission guidelines, but otherwise you're just adding, you're including extensive. We're trying to make 2026. For everybody else, we're going to be working at the intermediate level for a DSP project, unless you're going to have a project you feel needs to be at the intensive level. That would be up to between you and your regional director. The other comment I was going to make, and one more comment I would make is that, again, remember we've tried to build a single worksheet to address multiple ways of doing this to, trying to keep it simple, but at the same time address both designated DSP projects, KSL projects. So it's going to be variable in how your data is there, but we do expect you to get the data and fill out some of the other attachments.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions. I think we've exhausted all those. So I think, thank you, Chad. Thank you, Sky, for your time and effort to make this presentation. And thanks to all the participants for joining in. We hope you found this information beneficial. We exceeded the capacity on WConnect, and we had at least 200 people join today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our National Soil Survey Center YouTube channel within a few days. So feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. I would just point out that I do have a poll question there for everybody to answer. What webinar topic would you like to hear about? And if you want to put in your answers there, we'll take a look at those and try to follow up with folks to make that a reality.